Hello everyone, I'm Nat Rittmeyer and this is Under a Solid Sky. I'm not any kind of expert in anything we're going to be looking at. I'm just a layman reconciling his Christian faith with the findings of biblical scholarship. In this video, we're looking at this slightly unsettling problem of Nazareth's missing hill, what's known as the topographical problem of Luke 4 verse 29. So, what do we mean by a missing hill? Let's get into it. The passage we're zooming in on today is Luke 4 verses 16 to 30. The passage is commonly referred to as the rejection at Nazareth. Now, before we get into the topographical problem, let's first get a bit of background so we know where we are in the text. In Luke's Gospel, the lead up to our passage goes like this. In chapter 3, we've got Jesus' baptism. That's followed by his genealogy. We then get Jesus' temptation, and then the beginning of his Galilean ministry. Okay, with that as background, let's get into the passage and our topographical problem. Here's what the passage says with a few bits clipped out that aren't relevant to the topographical problem we're looking at in this video. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. So there we go. Now there's tons of stuff we could look at in this passage. There's synagogue practice in first century Galilee. There's the discussion around the Isaiah text that Jesus read and that Luke quotes. There's the symbology around Jesus leaving Jewish Nazareth behind for Gentile Capernaum. All sorts of interesting stuff. But in this video, we're going to look at verse 29, there in red, because it's in that verse that we have our topographical problem. Now, to get a handle on a topographical problem, we need to know which bit of topography we're looking at. We need to know the location of first century Nazareth where our passage takes place. Thankfully, as Ken Darke explains, the existing sources of evidence for the first century settlement at Nazareth shows that there is sufficient written and archaeological evidence to confirm that there was certainly a settlement of this date in the centre of modern Nazareth. Archaeology shows that the origin of this settlement lay in the late Hellenistic period. The first century settlement we can see through archaeology in the centre of modern Nazareth is the Nazareth referred to in the Gospels. Now we're going to be hearing a fair bit more from Ken Darke a bit later. As he says, based on quite a few excavations over the past 150 years or so, along with a whole load of textual evidence, there's enough agreement between the relevant scholarly experts on the location of first century Nazareth that a pretty reliable outline of the area can be drawn on a map. Here's one example. This map is from Yardena Alexander's 2020 journal article with the title, "The Settlement History of Nazareth in the Iron Age and Early Roman Period." You can see the outline showing where the first century Nazareth was in relation to the streets today, highlighted here. There are a bunch of other publications we could have taken maps from, but they're all pretty much the same, so this one will do. Okay, we've got first century Nazareth on the map. And with that established, we can now take the next step. Let's get into the topographical problem of Luke 4 verse 29, starting with the cliff. Where is the cliff that the synagogue crowd wanted to throw Jesus off? Now, the Holy Land being what it is, naturally there's a traditional site you can visit to see where this event took place. And that place is known today as Mount Precipice. Now this view we're looking at here is what you see from the Jezreel Valley as you drive toward Nazareth from the south. And if you follow this road, you'll end up in the city of Nazareth that lies behind those two hills. Now that hill on the right there is known as Mount Precipice. And it's about where the arrow is pointing that coachloads of tourists are taken to see where Jesus was almost thrown off the cliff that's mentioned in our passage. Let's join those tourists at the Blue Arrow and take in the view. So we're now standing where the Blue Arrow was pointing, and we're looking southeast over the slope across the Jezreel Valley, where so many events in the Old and New Testaments take place. It really is a beautiful spot that so many biblically significant sites can be seen from. So that's the view from Mount Precipice. What we're going to do now is keep looking in the same direction while we take a very long leap backwards. The blue arrow points to the top of Mount Precipice, where we started our big leap from. Now we're looking in the same direction as previously, but we can now see modern Nazareth in the foreground. Now, looking at this map, we can see the extent of first century Nazareth, and that's what it maps to on the ground. Now that we've got some idea of the layout, we can play out the event in our passage and get into the topographical problem. Let's read verse 29 again. They got up, drove Jesus out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. Look again at that phrase in the middle of the verse. The brow of the hill on which their town was built. The text is clear enough that the brow, or the cliff, that the crowd wanted to hurl Jesus from, marked the edge of the hill that Nazareth was built on. Thinking of what we've seen of Mount Precipice, does it match up with the description in the text? This photo again makes it pretty clear that Mount Precipice is not the hill on which first century Nazareth was built. First century Nazareth is not located on Mount Precipice, so the brow or cliff that Jesus was to be hurled off cannot be Mount Precipice. Let's take a look at a relief map. Again, the blue arrow at the bottom points to the location of Mount Precipice, and the red circle shows the location of first century Nazareth. What's clear from this relief map is that Mount Precipice is not the hill on which their town was built. It's not even close. There are a couple of hills between Mount Precipice and ancient Nazareth. But there's another nail to go into Mount Precipice's coffin. Remember that Jesus wasn't being threatened by a mindless mob looking for some entertainment on a Tuesday evening. Let's go back to the passage. Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and it was all in the synagogue who drove him out of the town. It turns out that scholarship is pretty clear on the religiosity of the people of Nazareth. Let's take a look. Jesus' boyhood was spent in a conservative Jewish community that had little contact with Hellenistic or Roman culture. This is from an article by Ken Dark, the director of recent excavations at Nazareth, whom we quoted earlier. Okay, so just how conservative were the Jews of Nazareth? Ken Dark continues. Nowhere else in the Roman Empire is there such a seemingly clear-cut boundary between people accepting and those rejecting Roman culture, even along the imperial Roman frontiers. This suggests that the Nazareth area was unusual for the strength of its anti-Roman sentiment and/or the strength of its Jewish identity. So the people listening to Jesus in the synagogue at Nazareth took their Judaism very seriously indeed. In fact, so serious were the Jews of Nazareth about their Judaism that after the failure of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, the 24 courses or divisions of priests from the temple in Jerusalem fled northward. One priestly family by the name of Hapizes settled in Nazareth. And we can be pretty sure why a priestly family would have headed for Nazareth. Nazareth had a deeply religious population, and they would have fitted right in. Now, with that bit of background, let's return to our relief map. The distance between Mount Precipice, which we already know isn't the hill upon which their town was built, and first century Nazareth is 2.35 kilometers or 1.46 miles. Now, depending on the commentary, they'll quote distances between 1 and 3 miles away, but simply doing a distance measurement in Google Maps will give you a straight line distance of 1.46 miles, around a mile and a half. This matters because the events that we read about took place on the Sabbath, and the deeply religious Jews in the Nazareth synagogue would not have been violating the Sabbath by going a distance greater than a Sabbath day's journey. How far then was a Sabbath day's journey? Well, the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary says this. The Sabbath day's journey the travelling distance permitted by religious law for the Sabbath is generally reckoned in Jewish sources as 2,000 cubits, approximately 1 kilometre. Can we get any more specific? Let's see what the Jewish sources say. The Mishnah has 1,000 amaz, or cubits, form the outskirts, while 2,000 cubits form the Sabbath limit. So yep, 2,000 cubits. But how long is a cubit? The New Encyclopedia of Archaeological Excavations in Holy Land says, cubit, biblical measure of length, equivalent to 18 inches or 44.65 centimetres. So depending on what you read, you'll get more or less precise figures, but 44 to 45 centimetres is about the average. Plugging these numbers into a pretty simple sum, we can work out that 2,000 cubits times 44.65 centimetres is 893 metres, or 0.55 miles. If we stick with the original 1 kilometre that we read in the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, we'll get an equivalent of 0.62 miles. So we're dealing with a distance for a Sabbath day's journey that's somewhere between half and 2/3 of a mile. How does that look on our map? A Sabbath day's journey of 1 kilometre, or 0.62 miles, gets you this far, but if it's 893 metres, or 0.55 miles, it only gets you that far. Clearly, a Sabbath day's journey falls pretty far short of the distance between 1st century Nazareth and Mount Precipice. So what can we conclude so far? Well, Mount Precipice is not the hill on which their town was built, and it is more than twice a Sabbath day's journey from 1st century Nazareth. So it's for these reasons that commentaries from even the very conservative end of the spectrum say things like that the monks show at a distance of 2 English miles from Nazareth another mount of precipitation is doubtless one of the grossest errors which tradition has committed in the sphere of the Saviour's life. Now, that's pretty harsh, but it's pretty fair. This brings us to the second part of the topographical problem. If not Mount Precipice, which is the hill on which their town was built? Let's take a quick look at that photo again. Luke 4:29 clearly states that the town of Nazareth was built on a hill, and it clearly states that the hill the town was built on had a brow from which the synagogue crowd could throw Jesus over a cliff. So, where is the brow of the hill? Where, for that matter, is the hill? If you look carefully at the location of 1st century Nazareth outlined in red, there is no hill. It turns out we've got a missing hill. This 1932 aerial photo is from when Nazareth wasn't so built up as it is today, and it predates the construction of the current Church of the Annunciation. Like before, the red line shows the area of 1st century Nazareth, and it's pretty clear that's not a hill. In fact, it's built on a slope of a hill that has at its top, has the top of it pretty far from 1st century Nazareth. And it's not just me who's noticed this. Here's an example that we'll read in pretty much every commentary that touches on the topographical details of Luke 4:29. It is difficult to know exactly what Luke meant in that Nazareth is built on a slope, and no clear brow or cliff is nearby. That's just one example of many that I came across. It's widely acknowledged by biblical commentators that the area of 1st century Nazareth isn't on a hill. Anyone visiting Nazareth today can confirm that fact with their own eyes. Another quote: "The precise and elegant description of the event and the geographical surroundings in verse 29 does not indeed correspond to the geographical setting of Nazareth." And that pretty much is the consistent message of most biblical commentators. Luke's description simply doesn't match the geography. In fact, some scholars argue that our passage is one of a number of places in Luke's Gospel that demonstrate that Luke seems to have virtually no knowledge of the topography of the Galilee, Samaria, or Judea. This is from John Kloppenborg in a pretty interesting chapter of a book on Luke that goes through looking at what we can tell about Luke's geography, or Luke's knowledge of the geography of the places mentioned in his writings. Kloppenborg explains that Luke's geography improves once he reaches the Mediterranean coast, and when the story of Acts takes the reader up into the areas of modern Syria, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. But when it comes to Jesus' movements throughout Galilee, Samaria, and Judah, serious geographical gaffes appear in the travel narrative. Now, that is a pretty tough statement for inerrantists to swallow. The idea that there are mistakes in the Gospels so bad they can be described as gaffes just doesn't fit that particular worldview. Personally, I'm not an inerrantist, so this sort of thing bothers me not one bit. But friends of mine do really struggle with these sorts of problems. So, what can be done about this missing hill? Well, various ways of dealing with it have been proposed. Let's take a look at a couple of them. Back to our old aerial photo. The area of 1st century Nazareth is outlined, so we're looking for a cliff that's at the edge of the admittedly missing hill that the town was built on. At this location, marked in blue, is the old Maronite church. According to some of those who travelled through Nazareth back in the 1800s, like John Quito, for example, he writes this: "In the southwest part of the town is a small Maronite church under a precipice of the hill, which here breaks off in a perpendicular wall 40 or 50 feet in height. Dr. Robinson noticed several such precipices in the western hill around the village, and with very good reason concludes that one of these, probably the one just indicated, may well have been the spot whither the Jews led Jesus." Now, this same cliff here that we've just read about is mentioned in other travellers' reports, like Bartlett's From Egypt to Palestine, but I've yet to come across a photo of it. If you know of one, please leave a link in the comments. Coming back to the photo, it's clear that the supposed cliff is halfway up the slope of a hill that 1st century Nazareth was definitely not built on. So we can kind of rule out that explanation. Another attempted resolution to the problem is that the chalky rock of the area is so crumbly that any evidence of the missing hill just crumbled away. Here's one example quote. "It seems that formerly the city was situated higher up on the mountain slope, and the steep rocks from the top of which the foolish crowd wanted to throw the divine doctor have changed shape as a result of the frequent earthquakes in Palestine." Now, this is a Google translation of a quote from a guy called Van der Velde, who was a cartographer who mapped the Holy Land in the 1850s. Now, Nazareth certainly does suffer from earthquakes. Last time I was in Nazareth, relaxing on my hotel roof after a particularly long and trying day, I experienced a minor earthquake. The whole building shook. Earthquakes happen there pretty frequently. But as nice and convenient as an explanation as that would be, there's no evidence that the area of Nazareth has crumbled away to anywhere near the degree or extent that it would have needed to for the hill and cliff to just disappear. There are delicate archaeological remains in Nazareth from the Bronze Age, a couple of thousand years before Jesus lived there, and those have survived just fine. So it seems a stretch then to say that earthquakes affected only the topographical elements mentioned in Luke 4:29, while the rest survived just fine. So no, there are no real good ways to explain the topographical problem away. So this missing hill problem really does make it seem like Luke doesn't know what he's talking about. He puts 1st century Nazareth on a hill that quite plainly doesn't exist. And so if you visit Nazareth, you'll notice the occasional overconfident, smug skeptic taking photos like this selfie of mine from Mount Precipice that clearly is nowhere near the current location of 1st century Nazareth, or taking photos looking straight over the top of ancient Nazareth from further up the slope, showing that it's not on the top of a hill at all. The topography of Nazareth is clear. Luke got it wrong. So, imagine my surprise when I picked up Ken Dark's recent book on the archaeology of Nazareth and scanned the section on natural Nazareth, where he explains the lay of the land and has this to say. Until the 19th century, a wadi ran through what is today the centre of modern Nazareth. Its line was up the present street immediately outside the Church of the Annunciation, passing under what is today the Franciscan Catholic pilgrim hostel called Casanova, built in 1837. Physical evidence of this wadi was discovered when the hostel was rebuilt in 1863, and also when the Church of the Annunciation was being rebuilt in the 1960s. The Nazareth Wadi must have been one of the most distinctive landscape features in the whole area before it was infilled. Well, I was not expecting to read anything like that. We have an unexpected wadi. A quick tangent for those new to the term wadi, it's the Arabic name for a dry stream bed flooded during rainy season. As an example, here's the famous Wadi Kelt in the West Bank. It's a pretty dramatic example. Not all wadis are as deep or as wide. Many are just a few meters deep and wide. Here's a slightly less dramatic one. It's the Wadi al-Wala in Jordan, just north of Diban. It's a lovely place. Once had lunch there whilst I was visiting the biblical sites in Jordan. Anyway, back to the quotes from Ken Dark's book. It hadn't occurred to me that the topography of 1st century Nazareth might be different to the topography of modern Nazareth. But then, if this wadi, which Ken Dark describes as one of the most distinctive landscape features in the whole area, could no longer be seen, then it's kind of back to the drawing board about any conclusion about Luke's topography based solely on the layout of modern Nazareth. Any such conclusion is based on incomplete information. So down this new rabbit hole I went. I wanted to see if anything else could be read about al-Wadi. Has anything else been written about it? The first book I looked up was one I already had on my shelf, Yardena Alexander's report on the Mary's Well excavations, just a few hundred meters north of the Church of the Annunciation. Here's what she had to say. The mapping of the Roman period burial caves located on the outskirts of the settled area enables a general definition of the village limits in the area of the present-day Franciscan compound. The Roman period Koch caves in the Sisters of Nazareth convent just west of the Franciscan compound is separated from the settled area only by a small wadi. Okay, there's our wadi again. But we haven't found out much more, only that it runs between the Franciscan compound and the Sisters of Nazareth convent. But it does exist. The wadi is a thing. It was time to go further down the rabbit hole. I found that Ken Dark had written an article back in 2012 where he went into a bit more detail. Until its 19th century infilling, there was a steep-sided wadi approximately along the line of the present Casanova Street, the street that runs immediately in front, or west, of the current Church of the Annunciation. Traced by Bagatti, the wadi ran northward following the metalled road which runs to the Fountain of the Virgin, the road northwest of the Church of the Annunciation, leading eventually to St. Mary's Well. Based on that, I went looking for Ken Dark's source, the write-up of the excavations led by Bagatti. So who's Bagatti? Bellarmino Bagatti was a Franciscan priest and archaeologist, and he was director of the excavations that took place in Nazareth when the Church of the Annunciation there was being rebuilt between 1955 and 1966. Volume 1 of the English translation of his write-up was published a few years later, and it's that book that Ken Dark was referring to. So I looked it up on AbeBooks and found there was a single very expensive copy available, but decided I'd sleep on it and I'd buy it in the morning if I decided I still wanted it. When I logged on in the morning, it was gone. Someone else had bought it, and it was more than a year before I was notified that another copy had become available. There was no hesitation this time. Anyway, it arrived, and it does indeed describe the wadi. But there's more. The mention of the wadi is in a section on the ground level of the excavations. Bagatti explains that a first work to verify the stratigraphic nature of the terrain and depth of the rock consisted in a trench made in 1955 to the east of the Church of the Annunciation. The trench runs from east to west, almost parallel to the south wall of the Crusader Church, from the east wall of the church. So he had a trench dug. Here's a photo of it. I'm sorry about the picture quality, it's this bad in the book, but check out the size of the guy at the back of that trench there. That's a pretty deep trench. Anyway, on with the quote. At 2.2 meters from the surface, there was a layer of small stones with earth, and at 5.6 meters, the rock. As the surface descends from west to east, since we are on the eastern declivity of the hill, so also the rock. Okay, so that's pretty easy to understand. The line of bedrock is 5.6 meters below the surface, and as the surface slopes downward in an easterly direction, the bedrock slopes down with it too. So let's stick this trench on a map. Here is roughly where the church was, to the right of the Church of the Annunciation in the center of the image. So we've got a slope. This isn't a surprise though, because as we saw earlier, modern Nazareth is built on a slope. What's interesting is the wadi we've heard about from Ken Dark's book. Begati continues, to the west of the Church of the Annunciation, the section shows a wadi and the beginning of the mountain that stands in front. The lowest point corresponds to the present metalled road which runs to the Fountain of the Virgin. When rebuilding the Casanova, it was observed that there was a wadi there. The confirmation of this observation came in 1956, when the workers of the engineer Antonio Balduzzi were carrying out surroundings by rotation in order to study the structure of the terrain. On our request, soundings were likewise made to ascertain the course of the rock. The soundings were made in the little street that divides the Casanova from the seat of Catholic Action. Okay, that was a big quote. What it amounts to is this. Soundings that were made before and during the excavations show that the wadi we've been reading about runs along the west side of the church under the road that runs outside it. Let's put it on a map. There it is. Again, the darker colour indicates the lower part and the lighter colour the higher parts. Begati found that the line of the wadi followed pretty much the line of the road outside the church, shown here in red. That means that when you look north from here, in red at the bottom of the screen, with this sort of view, where the road that Begati mentioned goes north along the front of the Church of the Ascension, where it can be clearly seen, you can see where the wadi used to be, under that highlighted road. Now the point of the wadi is this. It separates the area of 1st century Nazareth from the larger slope of the hill that it sits on today, and it creates a separate topographical unit. So this wadi, when was it filled in? In her 1920 article that we referred to earlier, Yardena Alexander makes a passing comment about a painting. The location of Old Nazareth on the slope, with a small wadi to its west and a steep drop to its east, is illustrated in an 1839 lithograph by David Roberts. Naturally, I hunted down the lithograph and found this. It very clearly shows the wadi that we've been reading about. Now, if we zoom in a little, we'll see that the wadi is pretty deep. If the painting is accurate at all, then the wadi David Roberts saw was a few meters deep at least. Deep enough that the people of Nazareth built a bridge over it, as you can see. So when was this wadi filled in? Well, the wadi was still there in 1839 when David Roberts produced this picture, so the wadi must have been filled in sometime after 1839, comparatively recently. So, back to Begati. He drew a section through the area he excavated, and pretty clearly you can see the shape of a hill, just like a kid would draw a hill. The wadi on the west and the slope on the east. In between is the hill. Now, if we go back to Roberts' lithograph, we can really get a sense that describing 1st century Nazareth as being located on a hill, even just a small one, isn't in fact all that inaccurate. What we have here is the hill we discovered. The hill mentioned in Luke 4:29 may have lain hidden beneath the ground for the past couple of hundred years, but it was there all along. Now, Begati makes this point quite explicitly in his writing. In his introduction, he has this to say. This view has certainly a historic importance, since, showing as it does, Nazareth as yet isolated on 3 sides by wadis, we come to understand why it was said that it was built on a mount. Such evidence has today been removed by the raising of the level in the wadis. And he puts it even more pithily in his entry on Nazareth in the New Encyclopedia of Archaeological Excavations in the Holy Land, where he writes, the Church of the Annunciation, which is right where 1st century Nazareth was located, is situated on a small hill surrounded by ancient graves south of St. Joseph's Church. And that's pretty unequivocal. Nazareth, according to Begati, the man responsible for the most comprehensive excavations to ever take place in Nazareth, is quite clear that 1st century Nazareth, against all the claims and confusion of many commentators, really was built on a hill. So what about Ken Dark, director of recent excavations in Nazareth? He says about the description of Nazareth as on a hill, this is another point often thrown down as evidence of Luke's unreliability. However, as we have seen, archaeology attests 1st century activity on the top of the hill, and on a hill slope terrace at the Sisters of Nazareth site, and on a more or less flat location at the Church of the Annunciation and International Marian Centre sites. Nazareth might be said to have been on a hill, or the slope of a hill, or on level ground. In fact, it was all of these. Again, this part of Luke's account of Nazareth can't be used to undermine his credibility. So, Ken Dark affirms the fact that there's plenty of evidence of a 1st century Nazareth in his book, with the 1st century Nazareth village being on the top of a hill, highlighted there in red. So, the main excavators of Nazareth both say the same thing. 1st century Nazareth really was built on a hill. And so, this information finally is making its way into modern scholarly works. For example, about the steepness of the wadi, it's now recognized by scholars such as Rainer Reisner that the precipice of the hill on which Nazareth was built, and from which some attempted to hurl Jesus, has been confirmed archaeologically on the west side of the present-day Church of the Annunciation. Archaeologically speaking, there really is no question anymore. Nazareth was built on a hill, and the wadi at its western edge is the cliff that the crowd wanted to throw Jesus from. Okay, all that being said, it's time to think about what this means for us. What are some implications for us laypeople? Well, as we said now, 1st century Nazareth really was built on a hill. We really shouldn't assume that topography doesn't change over time. It's also worth pointing out that everyone works with incomplete information, even scholars, and most things are up for revision. Not everything, but most things. On the other hand, just because Luke was right in 4 verse 29 doesn't mean he's always right. There are still a number of examples where the gospel writers, their geographical details don't line up with details on the ground or with each other. Finally, this is not an exercise in apologetics, though it may feel like it to some. It just happens to be an instance where taking the text at face value is possible. So there we go. This has been Nazareth's missing hill, the topographical problem of Luke 4 verse 29. Anyway, you know the drill. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. See you later.